Are we still missing Elie? Okay.
Yes, he hasn't arrived.
Do you want to send him a message? No?
Yeah, I can send him a message.
Do you want me to start letting people in? Okay.
Already. Hi, welcome everyone. Just give the people a minute or two to arrive before we start. Welcome everyone. I think we can slowly start and still welcome people in. Well, I would like to welcome you to this third webinar in a series of 4, trying to answer 2 essential questions when it comes to MHPSS services. The first one is, are we doing the right things? And the second is, are we doing them right? In the first 2 webinars, we spoke about assessments and about the importance of contextualizing our tools and methods and culturally adapt them to the context we're working in. And in today's webinar, we will talk about monitoring and evaluation. My name is Monia. I'm working for the Swiss Red Cross and I'm co-leading a working group under the MHPSS roadmap with Sarah-Kate van der Walt from the ICRC PS Center. But before we start, we would like to inform you that this session is recorded so that we can use it later again. And this webinar is held in English with translations to Spanish and French. You'll find the according translations in the bar below under the icon, the world and globe icon. We would like to ask you also to write your name, your organization, and your email address into the chat so that we can reach out to you later on with the recordings and the resources that we're sharing today also. Now, this webinar series is organized by the Priority Action Area 4 Working Group committed to the implementation of the MHPSS roadmap. Now, not everyone present here might be familiar with this initiative. So for this reason, we would like to start with a short introductory video on the MHPSS resolution, policy, and the roadmap, just to give you an idea of the context we're operating in.
In the following presentation, we would like to give you a very brief and simplistic introduction to the mental health and psychosocial policy, resolution and roadmap working groups. As for you to understand the connection with today's webinar and the MHPSS roadmap within the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. Every day, the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement around the world is confronted with the extensive unmet mental health and psychosocial needs. The movement saw an urgent need to increase efforts to address these needs, and therefore, in December 2019, the movement made historical commitments and adopted a joint movement policy on mental health and psychosocial needs in all contexts. Also, together with 196 states, the state parties to the Geneva Conventions, the ICRC movement recognized the urgent need to scale up the collective response to the MHPSS needs of people affected by armed conflicts, natural disasters, and other emergencies. Turning our attention back to the MHPSS policy, its aim was also to contribute to an enhanced ICRC movement response by providing overall guidance to national societies, the IFRC and the ICRC on how to build a more harmonized, integrated, contextually appropriate and holistic response to MHPSS. With the policy, a roadmap document followed, highlighting 6 priority action areas on addressing mental health and psychosocial needs. The roadmap sets out a strategic and coordinated approach in terms of the activities to be carried out individually by national societies, the IFRC and the ICRC, and activities to be carried out together. The ICRC and the IFRC and a group of national societies have supported and coordinated the rollout of the roadmap since 2020 by, for example, creating 5 working groups. These groups were officially formed based on the priority action area thematics. Working Group 1: Achieve a basic level of MHPSS across sectors. Working Group 2: Reinforce the movement's MHPSS collaboration. Working Group 3: Promote the MHPSS well-being of staff and volunteers. Working Group 4: Demonstrate the impact of MHPSS interventions. Working Group 5: Strengthen the advocacy for mental health and resource mobilization. For this webinar series, a number of national societies engaged in Working Group 4 have come together to showcase good practices from national societies and to highlight various aspects of monitoring and evaluation and research. The working groups are a unique space for various ICRC movement actors to exchange experiences and work jointly toward the implementation of the MHPSS commitments. The working groups continue to rely on the participation of national societies. For these groups to remain relevant, it is necessary that the participants from national societies represent all regions and all levels of MHPSS experience. Come and join the working group efforts to ensure your region's voice and experiences are being heard and represented in 2023 and beyond. Thank you for listening and enjoy the remaining of the webinar.
As we've heard in this short introduction video, the aim of our working group number 4 is to strengthen the evidence for our MHPSS services, as this helps us to improve the efficacy, efficiency, and effectiveness of MHPSS, and thus allows us to reach more vulnerable people with appropriate mental health and psychosocial support. Now I would like to hand over to your host of this webinar, Adrian Reed. Adrian is the Youth Director and Cash Voucher Assistance and Emergencies Focal Point at the Jamaica Red Cross. He's also responsible for all Red Cross youth clubs across Jamaica, and he's a principal for a school for youth at risk operated by the Jamaican Red Cross. Thank you for leading us through this webinar, Adrian. I hand over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Monia. You're very welcome. All right, so good day, everyone. Welcome. All right, so today what we'll be asking of you is if you have any questions throughout the presentations, please place them in the chat and we will have them addressed as we have the Q&A sessions. Additionally, as introduced, Monia will, Monia had introduced before, please also indicate your name, the country you're from, and your email address in the chat as well, so we are able to then send the presentations to you afterwards. We will be having a panel discussion at the end where we have our presenters who are present with us, just answer any questions that you may have posed throughout the various presentations. We have a presentation from 2 national societies today and also the ICRC from Lebanon, where they will be presenting on the best practices from their local situations. So, context, sorry. So without further ado, I will now introduce our first speaker, which is Esther Lemson. So Esther has worked for several humanitarian organizations in the Middle East before ending up back in her home country in the Netherlands. In Syria, she worked on long-term impact monitoring after humanitarian demining operations and behavioral change after education sessions for communities. She now works for the Netherlands Red Cross on monitoring and evaluation of the domestic programs. Esther, floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian. Thanks for that introduction, and I'm happy to be here, everyone. I'm going to share my screen with you, and I'm going to give you am I sharing the right screen? Yes, I think so. I'm going to give you a short introduction on M&E in MHPSS interventions. And what I would first like to do is show you this picture. So this picture is, what you see is a play pump. And that was an innovative water pump invented in 1989 by a water engineer in South Africa. And then it was modified and popularized by a marketeer. And this water pump, it pumped water from the ground, obviously, but was driven by, it was supposed to be driven by children playing around it and having to run around it. When we want to talk about the relevance of M&E, this didn't go exactly as planned. So what they monitored and evaluated this project, and what they found is that the children had to run all day to provide enough water for the community. Besides that, they also found out that in this community, these children were going to school, and the mothers ended up going to take the water for the community every day. And it felt a little bit undignifying to walk around that water pump all day to have enough water. And then in the end, also, they had to walk 27 hours a day around that thing to meet the goal of supplying the water for 2,500 people per pump. In the end, obviously, if they did good planning and if they did a good needs assessment, which we talked about in previous webinars, they would have found out that this intervention wasn't suitable for the context, right? But yeah, just to show that this, if you do good monitoring evaluation, then obviously you find out that this wasn't really suitable. But more importantly, if you do good planning of interventions, then you would have known that this, it would have been preventing this from happening in the first place. So this is just to show very briefly that the importance of M&E, and what they did in the end actually is to change the intervention completely to provide running water in schools for children. And that proved to be way more efficient and effective for the community in need. All right, so quickly, I would like to go through the PMER cycle. So we're talking about M&E today, but PMER is the planning, monitoring, evaluation, and reporting cycle from the ICRC guidance. But actually all humanitarian organizations use this, right? Some of them call it PMEAL with accountability and learning. Some call it MEAL, some call it M&E. In the end, most of the time it contains the same steps, which is planning your intervention, right? Monitoring, evaluating, and learning throughout. So the planning phase is where, well, without a good planning phase, there's no way to monitor or evaluate, because what are you going to monitor if you don't know what you're actually going to do, and especially what goals you want to achieve. So you start with the logical framework with SMART indicators, and that's basically a systematic way to represent your project logic. So it helps you to identify desired goals and changes that need to take place to achieve those goals, right? So these goals and changes, they're formulated as indicators, and they need to be SMART on most of the time, at least output and outcome level. And SMART then stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely. If they're not SMART, then it will be quite hard to measure them at all, and if you're achieving your goals. So if you have that logical framework for your intervention, then you have these indicators. How are you going to measure them? So you need an M&E plan or a meal plan to identify how are you going to measure those indicators. Is that by a participant list of a training? It could be as simple as that, in order to know how many people you've trained. Is that with a post-training test of knowledge in order to measure the outcome of increased knowledge on a specific topic? Or is that a survey with the community? It could be many things. It could be many measurement tools or means of verification. And then within that M&E plan, you also want to show, when are you going to collect that data? Who is going to do that? How are you analyzing it? And also, who is the audience of the information? Which audience is used for adapted changes to the intervention, or to be accountable to, for example, donors or grants. So once you have that all set and the intervention starts, then you start to monitor and evaluate. And the monitoring is actually throughout. Some people think that evaluation is only by the end of the project, but that can also happen throughout an intervention. It can be done after every single activity or by the project end. It could be many different things. Oftentimes, humanitarian interventions are evaluated by the 6 OECD DAC criteria. That's for the Humanitarian Development Initiative. And those are, for example, efficiency, effectiveness, relevance, coherence, sustainability. So according to those criteria, you want to see if your intervention is doing the right things. All right, I would like to go through some standard outcome and output indicators for MHPSS, and these are also to be found in resources that will be shared in the chat as well. Today, we're going to have 2 best practices or presentations, and one is going to be on care for staff and volunteers. One of them is going to be on an intervention for a community. And just for example, for care of staff and volunteers, there could be an outcome of a supportive, caring working environment that is achieved and sustained for staff and volunteers, right? Well, that is a goal. But then how do you make that measurable, or what do you actually want to achieve with it? So you want to achieve a specific percentage of all the national society managers, staff, and volunteers that are aware of their national society's self-care and team care policies, procedures, and resources. Now, this is not smart enough yet because the percentage doesn't have a target. But once you have, once you set your logical framework, you would create a target for this. These are just general guidance for national societies to use indicators that are already standardized. And then an output indicator could be a number of national staff trained in staff and volunteer care policies and procedures, systems and support skills, for example. Then on psychosocial service provision. So we also have many standardized outputs and outcomes that could be used for these types of interventions. And obviously it could be many, right? So this is just an example of one. So the outcome here is that the target population achieves and sustains personal and interpersonal well-being and capacity. Okay, so what we want to measure in the outcome is that the target population reports a change in personal well-being. That's not that easy to measure. I'm going to tell you in a second why. But this is what you want to achieve with the intervention. And then the output indicator could be the estimated number of target beneficiaries reached with psychological first aid, for example. Before we move on to those challenges that I just talked about, just a quick definition of what monitoring and evaluation is. And I assume most of you know this, but just to have a reminder of that. So monitoring is a routine collection and analysis of information to track progress against set plans and check compliance to established standards. It helps identify trends and patterns, adapt strategies, and inform decisions for project and program management. Then evaluation is an assessment as systematic and objective as possible of an ongoing or completed project, program or policy, its design, implementation, and results. The aim is to determine the relevance or fulfillment of objectives, developmental efficiency, effectiveness, and sustainability. Now, why is M&E then really important? Obviously, and most reasons why we do M&E, I think, internationally, is to be accountable to internal and external stakeholders. But also for internal purpose, it's so important to be able to adapt your program to be more efficient or more effective for the people that we're trying to help. So what is the project intending to change? Who will be benefiting from that? Are we on track with our set goals? How do we actually know if there's something wrong in our project? If we just run and go and we don't measure anything, we wouldn't know if we're doing something wrong or we're having any negative consequences or positive that we didn't even know, that we didn't even plan for. So what do I need to adjust and improve the intervention? And how do I know if the project is bringing about the change that I want? So for internal purposes, in order to adapt your programs to be most efficient and most effective for the people we want to help, it's really important to do M&E. Besides, obviously, the fact that we have to be accountable and transparent to our donors and to all stakeholders, also to the communities themselves. So these challenges that I talked about, well, we talked about well-being and how to measure well-being, and that's very subjective, and therefore it's a lot harder to measure. So if you ask me how I'm doing, in most of the cultures in the world, I would say, yeah, I'm fine, without actually going into details of how I feel and what that well-being then means, right? So it's harder to measure because it's subjective, but it also, not many people used to talk about well-being. And then the contact with the target population in MHPSS interventions is often brief. So if you have a conversation with a community member, it's often brief, and then it's quite inappropriate to ask right after, oh, was this conversation helpful to you? So in order to know the effect of the conversation you've had, you would need to ask these people, but might be inappropriate if you just had a 30 minutes conversation, right? And then also, we don't necessarily write all the information or contact details down from people that we speak to. So they're not really, you can't really trace them down afterwards to ask if their well-being, for example, is improved after this. And then also the MHPSS or psychological first aid interventions are often merged with other more practical aid provided. So if you have a distribution center where you distribute food parcels, for example, then And you also have a type of mental health, first aid or PFA conversation with these people. It's quite hard to ask them about the outcomes or the effects of the mental health, because where they came for was for the food parcel. And then the MHPSS interventions are often preventative. So that also makes it harder to measure the effect of it. And also many national societies, they said that financial capacity, financial challenges and capacity in order to actually implement M&E and measure and create all the measurement tooling and do the data collection, it actually takes a lot of work and capacity. So oftentimes it's also hard to do just because of those challenges as well. All right, I think that was it from my side. And then we can, then we can go to Adrian, back to Adrian. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much, Esther. All right, so for those who are just joining us, we are in our third webinar about monitoring and evaluation in MHPSS. Throughout the discussions, please place any questions that you may have in the chat. Also, please introduce yourself with name and your country you're representing or national society you're representing, and also your email address in the chat so we're able to then send the presentations to you afterwards. Additionally, throughout the presentations, we'll also be sharing various links to resources, so various websites where you can access the recordings of the sessions, various other tools and so on that we use throughout the whole monitoring and evaluation, as well as MHPSS as well. Throughout the sessions, we'll be putting those in the chat so you can access those there. We also have interpretation available in French and Spanish. So if you are not understanding the language that we're speaking right now, you can always go to the globe icon at the base of your screen, and you can then choose the language that you prefer there. So we are now about to move on to our next presenter. So our next presenter comes to us from ICRC Lebanon, and he is Elie Sarkis. Elie is a clinical psychologist and psychotherapist. Elie is a certified system therapist at the European Family Therapy Association, specializes in couples and families. Elie has worked in a private clinic and humanitarian aid since 2012, and the ICRC since 2015 with the families of the missing and helpers who for more recently lost persons. So we now hand over to Elie for his presentation. Thank you, Elie.
Thank you, Adrian, for the introduction. Thank you, everyone, for attending today. Today, as Adrian was telling, I will be presenting on Help the Helpers in Lebanon, and the tool used to measure the impact of our program in Lebanon is ProCall. I will start by contextualizing the program in Lebanon of Help the Helpers. Help the Helpers usually operates in areas where there is violence, critical incidents, armed conflict, as the ICRC does, where healthcare workers are unable to carry on with their job without having received support, because they would carry a double burden from being subject to the events happening and aiding the people who are subject to the violence and events happening. So when they are subject to this double burden, it means that they are more prone to burnout, compassion fatigue, secondary traumatic stress. And that is why we target this population. Healthcare workers in Help the Helpers context are highly prone to these conditions due to cumulative stressors and recurrent security incidents. In Help the Helpers in Lebanon, we focus on three main objectives, which all feed into the professional quality of life of healthcare workers and their resilience to ensure, first of all, their ability to do the job, and second of all, their well-being and our appreciation towards the healthcare workers. To do this, we provide the opportunity to the healthcare workers to process the impact of their work and work-related stress and life stress on their well-being. We enable them to deal with stressors in a more adaptive way for future incidents, therefore learning from how they behaved or how they coped and how they processed an incident and how they can better do that in the future, and eventually build the capacity of these healthcare workers to contain their emotional reactions and those of the patients that they work with to be able better do their job. By the way, I moved 2 slides. I forgot to tell you, Esther, sorry about that. So I'm on slide 13. Help the helpers session. Usually during the sessions, I allow the space to the participants of each group to ask or to show their own need to decide what we will be doing during this group process. Usually the group process is a series of 4 or 5 sessions, and the content of these sessions is highly adjustable to the needs of the participants. But there are some common themes, topics which are recurrent to all sessions, such as basic concepts of stress, how stress impacts our well-being, which areas of our body, of our psyche, nervous system, etc., how stress can be positive, acceptable or toxic, and how we regain a sense of control after having endured traumatic events, because this ensures our feeling of safety, how to notice burnout, compassion fatigue, or secondary traumatic stress, for them to be able to monitor their own well-being and their ability to continue to do the job without serious impact on their mental health. And the final 2 topics are breaking out of victimhood / being a savior, because this is a very recurrent theme in healthcare workers and humanitarian workers, where we find ourselves overstepping our own limits, physical and psychological, overstepping our ability to care for ourselves for the sake of caring for others. And what we do here is to remind these healthcare workers that the needs are endless, but their own ability to perform is limited. So we can never have enough resources as much as there are needs. And then finally, the final topic we work on is the toolkit for stress management and self-care. By toolkit here, I mean we focus on coping skills or coping strategies and self-care routine for the healthcare workers to be able to maintain their well-being, to be able to do the job rather than always having to answer to the stress that they have endured and then react by coping. Instead, when we talk about self-care, it's what we do to be able to continue to do the job. Moving on to the next slide of ProCall subscales. Why is ProCall essential for the helpers program? Because it has 3 subscales, or it measures 3 subscales, which are compassion satisfaction, burnout, and secondary traumatic stress. Here I will detail what each subscale is about. Compassion satisfaction is about the pleasure you derive from being able to do your work well. Higher scores on the scale represents a greater satisfaction due to the ability of being an effective caregiver on the job. And usually 25% of people score higher than average and 25% score lower than average. Second subscale is burnout. Most people have an idea of what burnout is from the nature of our job and how commonly this word is used. It is one of the elements of compassion fatigue and associated with feelings of hopelessness and difficulties in dealing with work or doing your job effectively. Usually these negative feelings have a buildup, so they have a gradual onset, and this buildup happens when we feel that our efforts on the job are making no difference, or if that we are feeling no appreciation from others, either from beneficiaries, from other colleagues, or even from ourselves, well, mostly from ourselves. And then higher scores on the scale doesn't mean that the person has burnt out, but that they are at risk of burnout. The average score on the burnout scale also is 50. 25% of people will score above 50, and then the other 25% will score below 50. And then if we want to really measure if a person is burnt out, we really need to make sure to have recurrent testing of Procol, because sometimes we endure a bad day or a bad week and we may score high on the burnout subscale, but that doesn't mean that we're necessarily burnt out. Anyway, it is a gradual process, so we may be on the road to burnout. The third subscale is secondary traumatic stress. It is the second component of compassion fatigue, and it is about work-related secondary exposure to extremely traumatic, stressful events. Therefore, the person is developing traumatic stress due to the exposure of someone else's trauma. So when healthcare workers are working with someone who has endured a traumatic event, due to the stories that they hear or to the impact of that traumatic event on their physical or psychological well-being, it is likely that the healthcare worker will become traumatized themselves. So when someone, for example, a soldier or a civilian working in medicine in an area where there is armed conflict and they are themselves subject to a traumatic event, this is not secondary traumatic exposure, it is primary. Secondary is only when we hear or when we interact with someone who is traumatized. The symptoms are very similar or exactly the same as any other acute stress or post-traumatic stress disorder, and are associated with a particular event. So we will find ourselves avoiding or having intrusive thoughts, images about the event itself. Similar to other subscales, it also has a middle score or average score of 50. We have 25% of people on average scoring below that and 25 scoring above that. Higher scores doesn't mean that the person does have secondary traumatic stress. It could be an indication that they may want to examine how they feel about their working environment and how threatened they feel while working in that environment. Next slide will be on the Procol results. To contextualize these results in Lebanon, here we find a pre-test and post-test. So as I told you, it is a group cycle of 4 to 5 sessions. So usually we have a pre-test and post-test to measure the impact of the intervention we're making. So here we can see on the 3 subscales, beginning with compassion satisfaction, we have 18% of people have had an average score and 82 had a low score, which here the low score is the negative outcome because compassion satisfaction is a positive indicator. Whereas in the post scores, we had an increase of the people who had an average score and a decrease of the people who had a low score. When it comes to burnout, we have 82% of the participants having an average score and 8% having a high score. And then in the subsequent post-test, we have 73% with average score and 7% of high score. And eventually in secondary traumatic stress, we have 43% of participants having an average score. And in the post-test, they move to 36% average scores. We see an improvement between the pre-test and post-test, and this is a good sign that the intervention is working. I would like to point out here that these scores or these tests are done within a short time frame, which is about 6 weeks, or sometimes if we have the luxury, it's about 8 weeks. And this is due to the constrictions of our project. But why is this a constraint? Because if we were to measure the impact of the intervention longitudinally, it would be more indicative of the improvement that the persons or the participants had actually made. To contextualize the scores also, here I have a couple of studies. One is on burnout and compassion fatigue in Lebanon. In a systematic review, they found that During the COVID-19 pandemic, 52% of healthcare workers suffered of burnout. The highest levels were among nurses and physicians at 66%, which is higher than rates reported in other studies performed during the last 2 decades. Also on secondary traumatic stress, post-traumatic stress, in 2022, out of 519 participants, 44% were at high risk of developing post-traumatic stress post-Beirut blast, if you've heard of the blast in Beirut. And then moving on to the next slide, how is Help the Helpers useful? Help the Helpers is very useful in the Lebanese context because it targets both work-related stressors and personal life-related stressors. It targets compassion fatigue, secondary traumatic stress, and burnout, and allows the participants to develop their own personal toolkit for a healthy continuation in humanitarian aid. Why are these 3 objectives very useful? Because in Lebanon, due to the recurrent crisis that the country has been going through, economic crisis, civil unrest, and armed, sometimes conflicts in specific areas, the Beirut blast and the pandemic mixed in with all of that, we've had a lot of loss in our capacity or in the healthcare workers, in the numbers of healthcare workers or capable healthcare workers. And therefore it is strata of the community we really need to care for to ensure the continuation of healthcare services in Lebanon. One example I will give in the last slide of the presentation is on working with the National Society in Lebanon doing the Help the Helpers program. Why did we choose to work in this project? In the physical rehabilitation project in Alay, Lebanon, the National Society, LRC, Lebanese Red Cross, work on developing ortheses, prostheses, and fitting the beneficiaries. And also there is rehabilitation, there are rehabilitation services, social workers, etc. So these people are in constant contact with the beneficiaries of the physical rehabilitation project, whom or most of whom have lost their limb, or they have endured a very traumatic experience to need this physical rehabilitation. Most of whom were subject to war or other traumatic experiences, and this means that these healthcare workers are constantly at threat of secondary traumatic stress, of compassion fatigue, and burnout. And therefore, we will implement the Help the Helpers program with this group sooner than later. I guess that's it for me. If there are any other questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
All right, thank you very much, Elie. All right, so in the chat, there was a question. One moment, please. Monia, did you?
Yes, there's a question on cultural adaptation of our tools and methods. The question from Deepali is if there are any resources or guidance documents available to support the validation of tools in a new context, or to support the development of quantitative tools bottom up based on local conceptualizations of mental health and well-being. Elie, do you have any? I would just like to refer you, Deepali, to our first webinar on cultural adaptations. I think you find many resources and also answers to these questions in the recordings of the first webinar. We will just link you to the website again. But Elie, do you have any knowledge of tools that might help for culturally adapting existing guidance or existing tools?
Not at all.
Esther, do you have maybe?
Not necessarily, but I would assume that the protocol, how you're doing it in Lebanon, Elie, is already culturally appropriate, right? So I think with every single tool that you use, in order to contextualize it and use it in a certain context, you definitely think about on how communities deal with, for example, stress or trauma, or I mean, even contextualizing is having to be able to deal with what happened with the blast, right? And to be mindful of that. So I'm not sure if you could maybe say something about that, Elie.
In general, using the protocol, I've noticed that doesn't have many cultural aspects or like sensitive statements where they would need to be culturally adapted. It really asks about very common human experiences about I am happy, I am satisfied when I do my job, I am glad to be helping others, which are pretty universal, I would imagine. But I prefer not to talk about this specific topic because I'm not an expert on tools or on M&E, but using the tool for a pretty extended period. I've been using it for about 3 years now, and it is pretty universal. So in Lebanon, although it's a tiny country, we do have a lot of differences within the culture, and it's never come up as an issue to having to translate or change or adapt anything within the tool. I would say if you examine the items, you would find that they are pretty universal to anyone.
Okay, great. I got a question by a personal message. Is there a way to test oneself for burnout?
Of course, you can use the protocol. The link is in the presentation.
Okay, great.
And the scoring also is in the link that is in the presentation. So you can take the protocol a few times, and then you'll definitely find out. Take it like every few weeks. I would say burnout is once you learn what burnout feels like, you will learn to observe it yourself. But for someone not coming from this experience or having experienced burnout themselves or worked with someone who is burnt out, I imagine the tool would help a lot.
Okay, understood. Great. Thank you. All right. I'm not seeing any other questions at the moment. So wait. Okay, this one is actually for Esther. Is there any way to revise the water pump design for use in other areas that would not have access to running water?
Oh wow, I have no idea. This is literally a way of telling you gotta have to plan your interventions. This play pump, to be fairly honest, was not well designed, so I would not recommend it to anyone. And there are so many different wash opportunities that I am not an expert on, so okay. I would not be able to give an exact answer to that.
Okay, understood. All right, so not seeing any other questions at the moment, so we will be moving on to our next presentation. So for our next presentation, based on time differences, our presenter actually can't be here with us right now, so what we have is a recording of the presentation. So for those of you who are just joining us, once again, we are at webinar 3 of our 4-part series. We host these webinars at on the last Thursday of each month. Well, next month being the last in the 4-part series. And so we are now speaking about monitoring and evaluation. If you're just joining us, once again, please place any questions that you have in the chat. Also introduce yourself and the country you're from, and also place your email addresses in the chat so you are then able to get the presentations afterwards. Additionally, if you are not an English speaker, as the presentations are in English, you can choose the globe icon at the bottom of your screen and choose the language. We have interpretations in French and Spanish, and you can then have your audio being done in those languages there. So our next presenter comes to us from the Australian Red Cross, and that is Safi Taye. And Safi is a senior project officer at the Australian Red Cross, working as data analyst with the strategy and influence team of the National Emergency Service Program. Prior to joining the Red Cross, Safi did his PhD and worked as a researcher and lecturer across different areas of humanitarian and development. Safi's current role involves a lot of staff capacity building, along with monitoring, reporting, and evaluation of the ES data. So without further ado, I'll now be having the presentation on Safi being played. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Safi Taye, and on behalf of the Australian Red Cross and its National Emergency Service, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to present some of our work that we do across the monitoring and evaluation in the disaster settings, especially at the national settings, and what we do with the data that we have and with the community engagements that we do across early recovery and resilience work that we do. So what I would like to do in this very short presentation, and I would like to acknowledge that this is a recording, so unfortunately this will not be interactive, and of course it's because of the time zones and how, of course, Australia is way ahead. So by now it would be 2 a.m. It would be very difficult for me to say something sensible at the time. So what I will do in this very short presentation, I would like to walk you through some of the work that we do in the emergency service with respect to our monitoring and evaluation work and the data that we collect. So primarily what we do across the emergency service is through this monitoring and evaluation framework that we have that guides our activities and the way that we work with different teams that we have across the states and territories in Australia. So we sit at the national team, but we have different states and territories that they work rather independently. However, we have this umbrella of a national team that we help the teams across the country to develop their own log frames and do their work. So the first question would be to ask that why do we have a monitoring and evaluation framework? So primarily we think that we have this one to understand what are we trying to achieve, and I will walk you through that steps and what is the main goal that we are trying to achieve. We try to measure the impact of our work and what we're meeting in whether we are meeting people's needs or not, to learn about our work and how we can, as we go, we can improve the work that we are doing, especially in regards to the community engagement that we do. It's to share learning with others. And of course, this is one of the platforms. However, we do a lot of advocacy. So we use the monitoring and evaluation framework as a guidance tool for us to share our learning and experience. And of course, to improve the sector. So that is ultimately what we are hoping to do by developing this M&E framework. So after years and years of work, we have developed this monitoring and evaluation framework based on this theory of change, and I'm sure many of you are aware. And this is just, of course, an example of what a national team is doing, and it depends, of course, on the context. But what we have set to be as our ultimate goal in the National Emergency Service here in Australia is to hope that communities are strong and resilient and have capacity to anticipate and respond and recover well from disasters. We, however, as just as a Red Cross organization, but also across the sector, we understand that this is a very long-term goal and sometimes very, very difficult or sometimes impossible to achieve, to have that level of capacity from the communities. So then what we work is towards these impact goals that we have and impact statements that we have, which we want people to be able to cope with psychological impacts of disasters. And then people have increased resilience in disaster settings. So what we have developed is a number of outcomes, and then of course indicators. So if you look at these, our framework, it goes from bottom up. So we have three main streams of work that we have, which is deliver or support that we do. We have a lot of strengthening that we work, that we aim to do, and then advocacy work, of course, is one of our core outcomes. And so we work towards these different outcomes, and we have set our outcomes, and we have indicators, and we have ways of verifying and measuring those. So if I want to just run through some of these outcomes, so this is how it is pretty much structured. At the start of each activity, each leads or coordinators, they're asked to look at these outcomes that we have, look at the indicators that we have, and then define the activities that they do. And then we will help them to find the means of verifications. Overall, the way that things are developed here in emergency service, and I can give a bit of an example here, is that if we look at these, each of these indicators independently, we can see that two of the indicators that we have, and of course, this should not be taken as a solo kind of way of interpreting the M&E framework. However, we identify that at least some of the outcomes are directly contributing to that stream of work that we do. So in the area of support that we have, we want people to report that they feel calm, safe, and hopeful, and people have access to quality psychosocial support. So those would be our outcome 9 and 10. And then when we talk about activities, we talk about delivering PFA, we talk about stress management strategies, we work with community engagements that we do. So they sit across our support, and of course there are two outcomes that directly contribute to that goal, to that outcome. And so on, of course, across the strengthening, we have various activities that we do, workshops and trainings, and we do a lot of work with supporting community initiatives. And they have, of course, a broader number of outcomes, and they largely they sit under our resilience work. However, we have moved from recovery to resilience, so there are a lot of, or some of the projects have moved. So there's, of course, an overlap that some of the recovery work that we do as well, they could easily be using some of these indicators in the log frames. And when it comes to advocacy, we do, based on this principle of good humanitarian practice, of course, we hold a lot of meetings, we advocate for psychosocial support, we support marginalized group, and they fall under this advocacy or advocating for a good humanitarian practice that we have under the M&E framework. And I hope this is not overwhelming the way that I'm explaining, but these are, of course, years and years of work that we have been doing. So what we do across emergency service, we have at least 3 ways of collecting data, and I will walk you through those very briefly if time allows me. So one of them would be that we have what we call it the emergency service activity data collection. And this is an example that I will just illustrate in a bit. It is to say whatever that we do across emergency service, especially in the after early recovery, which is the recovery and resilience and a lot of BAU work that we do, and that cycle, of course, as it goes. We do collect some standard questions, and then we have a number of questions, quantitative and qualitative, to collect from in a sense, a post-activity that's happening. So if one of our recovery or resilience staff officers, they are organizing an activity for the community, then they will come and fill this form, and then that would be straight, uploaded into the dashboard that we have. So we use that for our constant improvements of work. Then what we also have is what we call it outcomes reporting form, and this is a higher level, and this happens every fortnight. And these are mainly states leads and our coordinators. So they sit at the end of each month, they have a conversation with their teams, and they develop little stories around how did we contribute to that specific outcome. So they would go and they select if their work was related to, let's say, outcome 9 and 10, and they say, okay, so we have done a number of activities, but how did we really contribute to those outcomes? So it's not just the activity, it's going beyond that. So that would be something that we collect every quarter. But then also what we have a number of surveys that we run after workshops and trainings that we do. One of the very old kind of programs that we have is the pillowcase workshops that we run these information sessions at schools, and then we ask teachers to provide a bit of statements, a few summaries of what do they think, how do they think the activity went. So they've all been uploaded again into this in using Kobo form. I should have mentioned that earlier. So we use Kobo form as well for most of our data collections. And then, so of course, we have these surveys, and then these surveys as well, they are combined with the activity form that we have, and then they are visualized into the Power BI dashboard that we have as well. So if I want to just go a very, have a very brief explanation of what we do, so I thought it would be best to actually show that in real time. So what I will do is I will just share my screen, and I hope this does not interrupt the flow of the recording. So this is what we call it, the monitoring and evaluation, the activity form that we have. And if you look at this form, it sounds very comprehensive because we do collect different levels of data, and they are very much aligned with the monitoring and evaluation framework that we have. So we go back to make sure the M&E framework is the backbone of the data collection. So we only collect data that we know that they are useful and they have an impact. So they directly they are linked to the monitoring and evaluation framework that we have. So we ask some, just the name of the person who filled this form, just to mention that because, sensitivity issues, we do not collect any identifiable information in this form. So all the data, that activities, and even the sentiments that we collect are all anonymous, and they're not identifiable. So here we collect a few standard questions. What is the disaster event? And of course, as it is happening across the world, we are constantly getting more and more events. So in Australia now we have a number of active disasters or projects that we have in post-disaster. So we have the New South Wales floods of 2022. So we're still doing a lot of work with the communities in that aspect, even though we are doing some work still from 1920 bushfires. And I'm sure many of you remember that Australia had this massive, and now of course, unfortunately, it's more frequent. So, and then we collect who is funding this activity, if there's internal or external. Then we ask what level of psychosocial support did you provide during this activity. So we look at PFA to be the highest level of social support that we do, but we do also as well have level 1 and level 2 as well, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with the IASC intervention pyramid. I'll just leave this bit, but what I wanted to do is that we ask several questions, including what did you do? So here, if let's say an individual, an officer provided a psychosocial support, especially PFA, to a community member, so they would come here and they try to do this report that if this was not initiated by the community, that's okay. And so what I want to really go through is this bit that we have here, is we ask under community engagements, what was the activity that the officers they engaged in. It's a number of activities that we have. If it's not, they would just say others, and they would just enter that manually. But let's say for the purpose of that activity I just explained, so this would have been a face-to-face conversations with a community member. And then, of course, we ask a few other questions. Where did this conversation take place? This was even on the streets, or it was in a home visit that we did. How many people did you speak to? In this case, it would be just one. Then we ask the question of what else did you do? So in the number of activities, we really don't do anything else. But there are instances where we are doing something. We are, for example, as it explained, it's illustrated here, we are doing delivering a training, we do a bit of advocacy, we support the community initiatives, but we ask what else did you do? So did you do anything else while you were doing this activity? And more often than not, is that we do something else as well. So that would be, let's say we made a connection with a community member. So we just record that one as well. We advocated for something, we record that. And then of course, we have several other questions, including, what type of material did you share, or if you shared anything. And what we have towards the end of this form, we have what we call the community sentiment summaries. So here we ask our staff to write a couple of sentences in a way that they see that what the community has expressed, our community members have expressed, and what did they observe, and what were some of the opportunities and challenges. So with this form, after it's submitted, of course, it goes to this dashboard that we have. And this dashboard, of course, is this dashboard is designed to reflect the monitoring and evaluation framework. So we have support, strengthen, advocate. So those were the three main streams that the work that we did. We have revamped our work. So this is only from 2023. We have a dashboard from last year as well. So if you look at when those data were selected, that yes, we had a community event or we had individual conversations. Here we can see that yes, that was a face-to-face conversation. And as a result of that, we provided PFA to a community member. And then this was delivered, let's say, at home. So we can see that how the data is being, it's being changing in the dashboard. And of course, this is a very comprehensive dashboard across the country. So once we in fact go to each section, we have community sentiments, and those are those comments that was added at the end of the document or the form. And here you can see that we have community sentiments. So what we do also with a lot of this qualitative data, at the end of each month, we go through all these comments and we generate a short document, a one-pager. We call it the monthly community sentiment summaries, and they are produced based on each of the activities that we have, so each of the events that we have. So here we have a number of events, so there will be one created for each of them. So that is pretty much a very brief explanation of what we do across emergency service, especially with the data collections and how they all feed into this monitoring and evaluation framework that we have. I'm really sorry that this could not be a live conversations, and if I have missed any questions. However, the information will be available to you, so please do not hesitate to reach out if you have any questions, comments, or you just want to stay in touch. We would love to build our network and to learn from our colleagues across the globe. And we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you so much, and all the very best. So yeah, enjoy the rest of the activity. Thank you.
All right, great. So that was Safi from the Australian Red Cross. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, so I guess I'll be handing over to Monia to well, okay, so we'll now have a panel discussion where we have some questions. We had set some questions ahead of time that we would have so we'll have our panel coming together now, and we'll be having a quick discussion about just answering these questions. And if you have any other questions while we have this discussion, then you can always post them in the chat as well. So Monia.
Yes, there were, just to mention, Baba put some resources into the chat concerning cultural adaptation, so please consider those ones, and maybe Baba, you can say something more about them later. Well, we do have a question concerning Safi, and it's about the protocol. It's quite an extensive measurement tool. So is it difficult to get this prioritized, and how much time does it take to do so? I mean, can you say something about that?
Yeah, well, Safi is not here, but I can try.
Oh, sorry, it was to Elie. Sorry, the question went to Elie. Sorry, but there's another question to Safi. Then I'll get back to you. Sorry, I still
No worries.
confusion. No, this was Elie.
You're muted, Elie.
Oh, sorry. Where can I read the question, please? I wasn't following. Sorry about
Sorry,
that.
I'll read it. I'll say it again. It says the protocol is quite an extensive measurement tool. Is it difficult to get this prioritized and take the time for this? I mean, does it take time to prioritize it?
Protocol.
I didn't understand the statement at all. How is it?
Okay. The protocol tool is quite an
Yeah.
extensive measurement tool. Is it difficult to get this prioritized and take the time for this?
It's about 25 items. It's not so extensive, no. It takes about like 5 minutes to fill out per participant, 10 minutes tops.
Okay.
And it's designed in a self-reporting way, so you can,
Yeah.
you can just give it to the participants. They can take 5-10 minutes and do it.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, for those listening in, the voice in the background you're hearing is one of our other members of our team, that's Bava. Bava has worked with several leading humanitarian institutions and published numerous scholarly articles in the advancement of assessing, designing, delivering, and evaluating mental health and psychological services, particularly in lower and middle income areas. His work has focused on contexts within Asia, Central Asia, West Africa, and Southeast Asia. He has also worked with the International Red Cross and Red Crescent in areas of missing persons, natural disasters, and violent conflicts. He is the ICRC Regional MHPSS Specialist in the MENA region, based in Amman, Jordan. So you'll hear him tuning in from time to, or chiming in from time to time with answers to particular questions that are placed. Thank you. Back to you, Monia.
Yes, there is another question to Esther and Elie. I don't know who of you is going to answer that. What is your experience with, you said you use the protocol, but do you also measure outcomes? Do you more measure outcomes directly with the beneficiaries or mainly secondhand through MHPSS practitioners? What is your experience?
Yeah, I would not be able to say for Safi, I think, but for the Netherlands Red Cross, I could. So yeah, we try in the Netherlands Red Cross to ask beneficiaries themselves, but only if it's an extensive intervention that we do, so not for half an hour. And then what we do is, so if it's an hour conversation or half an hour conversation, for example, lately in shelter locations for refugees where we support as the Red Cross, then what we do is ask the volunteer. So we ask the volunteer, the aid worker, to give their subjective measurement on how they feel it has impacted. Do people come across as less stressed? And it's super subjective, but we know that because then you cannot ask the beneficiary themselves. If we do trainings on MHPSS with beneficiaries, or if we do trainings on resilience, for example, with undocumented migrants, then we do ask how it could impact their lives and how they would, for example, take action upon the information they've received. So yeah, if it's more extensive interventions, then we do measure on outcomes with the beneficiaries. Bav or Elie, do you want to add
Sure.
something?
For the for the ICRC, because we work a lot on the layer 2 and layer 3 of the pyramid, and include level 4, that is more for referrals and occasional, clinical psychologists providing psychotherapy. So we do measure for across the board, whatever we do measure, and we utilize self-reporting tools that is but it's directly done by the beneficiaries. So for populations that are not very literate and they cannot fill the forms themselves, we would do an interview and ask those questions, but not make a judgment call. It's, again, generally it's in a scale of, never, always, and all of that, 5-point, 3-point Likert scale. So whatever subjectively the beneficiary is saying, that is recorded before an intervention starts and after the intervention ends.
There's no more questions in the chat. This is the last occasion for you to ask questions to Esther, Bava, or Elie. Please use this opportunity.
If you want, I could pipe in on the cultural adaptation a little bit. So I'm sorry, I missed the session on the webinar on cultural adaptation, but not managed to go back and take a look at it. But typically there's several methods that people have used for adapting in different cultural contexts. So one is simply it's a translation and a blind back translation, which means you have the item translated in a certain language, and then you take that translated version to another bilingual speaker, and then get that person to back translate it to the original language blindly. He cannot see the original set of questions. And in this translation, then when there is a discrepancy in terms of translation, then you need to sit as a team and try to find the most colloquial way of how to formulate that question. And if the translation is done more of a literal translation, like, one of the questions in a depression scale is, do you feel blue? So now if you start translating, do you feel blue as a color, you're gone. Nobody understands that. Do you get butterflies in your stomach? Nobody gets that. So in the translation, it has to be a conceptual translation rather than a literal translation. So, once a translation is done and a blind back translation is done, then a team comes into a consensus. Then that is still not done yet. You need to pilot it with the kind of beneficiaries that you would have. So just to test if comprehension is there or not. And especially for self-reporting questionnaires, you should not need to explain that question any further, because then reliability can be challenged. Because if I ask and give an example, and if Elie asks and gives another example, it can bring differences in answers. So it has to be, you read out the question, the person should be able to understand and be able to answer that. So that's one way. Another way is also there's qualitative methods where Paul Bolton, I have an article myself, where you can go to the community and do a free listing of what are the problems, and if that problem is there, so what are the symptoms. So you get it from their local expressions of distress, and then you compile it and find the equivalent English for your understanding. But the questionnaire then is developed locally. It can be validated. There are methods of validating that. Yeah, I could send you a couple of articles of that as well. So that's another way. So if you do not want to use the standardized tool that is being used across the globe. Yeah, thank you. And I posted 2 little articles. One was on the protocol where they were looking at Greece, and they didn't have to adapt so much because, as Elie said, it's very easily understood. It's not fancy concepts. And then there is another article that talks about how to do the translation, blind back translation. Thank you.
All right, so we're not seeing any other questions at the moment, so I guess we will just do the wrap up then. Monia, over to you.
Yes, thanks, Adrian. And while I'll be wrapping up and take the opportunity for a quick recap of what has been said, I would like to ask you to answer our 3 poll questions that will pop on your screen now. I hope it works. Your answer will really help us improve the last webinar and make it really relevant for practitioners. So please take the time to quickly fill in this poll. So what have we heard today? Like from the case studies from Australia and Lebanon, we impressively learned why is it essential to put evidence at the center of our work with communities. Yes, there it goes. Please feel free to fill it in quickly. Measuring is not just, we're not just measuring output, but also outcome or even social impact. It is important for several reasons, as we've heard. It helps us build concrete understanding of threats and opportunities arising from working in the humanitarian context. It helps us understand if and how our interventions are helpful, and thus also helps us improve our work and do our work better. But a systemic monitoring enables us also to showcase the work that is done to different stakeholders and donors, as we've heard from Esther. We've been introduced to many helpful resources and tools in this webinar. We will provide all those information and tools and also the recordings through the PS Center's website after the 10th of April. We will share the link again. You will find the recordings of all 4 languages that are available. Now, what remains for me to do is to thank everyone involved in today's webinar. A big thank you to Esther and Bava, who organized this webinar and behind the scenes, and also to you, Esther, for introducing us to the topic. Thank you to Adrian for hosting us, to Elie from Lebanon, and also Safi from Australia for sharing their very rich experiences and learnings with M&E with us. It was very interesting. And a big thank you also to our 4 interpreters in Spanish and French, and last but not least to Natalie for all the technical support through all the webinars. Without you all, this webinar could not have been possible. So thanks a lot for your support and for your presence. And I would also like to take this opportunity to invite you to our very last webinar. Adrian mentioned it already. The topic of the last webinar is research, and it will be held on the 27th of April. Same time, same place here. You can join through the same link that you used today. And the very last word, if you would like to get involved into the MHPSS roadmap with us for this initiative, we really invite you to become part of our working group. Please contact me, or also you can also reach out to Natalie from the PS Center. You'll find the email addresses also on the flyer or in the chat. We can put it in the chat also. Now, I wish you a very nice rest of the day, and I hope to see you again on the 27th of April. Same time, same place, and I can give you back almost 10 minutes of your day. Have a nice evening, morning, wherever you are. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming.